Morning I almost signed away everything I spent 38 years building started like every other morning in my life, with bad coffee and a view of the St. Lawrence River. I was 64 years old, standing in the kitchen of the house my wife and I bought in 1991. The one with the cracked tiles we always said we'd replace and never did. She passed 6 years ago. Breast cancer. Fast and brutal. The way it always is when it takes someone who didn't deserve it. After she was gone, the house got quieter than I knew a house could get. The ticking of the hallway clock started to sound like something accusatory. My daughter had been my reason for staying busy, not in the way fathers say that as a sentiment. I mean literally. She came into the business 3 years after her mother died, and I poured everything I had left into teaching her. 38 years of building a mid-sized commercial roofing company from one pickup truck and a willingness to work Sundays. All of it, I wanted her to have it. Aldridge Roofing, her grandfather's name. Her name. She'd always been sharp. Even as a kid, she sat at the kitchen table doing math homework while I went over invoices, and she'd look up sometimes and ask me questions that surprised me. Dad, why do you give Gordon Construction a 30-day extension when they always pay late? She was 11. I remember laughing and telling her she was going to be dangerous someday. I should have remembered that conversation more carefully. Her name is Vivian. She married a man named Scott 4 years ago, a project manager from Mississauga who I genuinely liked at first. Confident, organized, the kind of guy who always had an opinion about everything but usually backed it up. He'd worked in construction logistics, knew the industry, spoke the language. When Vivian brought him to a family dinner and he asked me intelligent questions about bonding requirements and WSIB compliance, I thought she chose well. The celebration dinner for my 64th birthday was held at my daughter's house in the west end of Ottawa, the house I helped them with the down payment on, which I say not to hold it over anyone, but because it matters to the rest of this story. It was a Saturday in late October, the kind of cold that comes early in Ontario and doesn't apologize. The backyard maple had gone completely red. I remember noticing it when I pulled into the driveway and thinking my wife would have taken a photo. The dinner was lovely. Des biens mets tourtière from a grandmother's recipe. Scott opened a bottle of wine. I wouldn't have known the difference on, but that he said was good. My son-in-law's parents were there, a quiet couple from Burlington. There were maybe 12 people in total. My accountant's wife, a few neighbors, my old site foreman Ray, who'd been with me since the 90s. At some point, I stepped away to use the washroom down the hall. The bathroom door was next to the door of Scott's home office, which was slightly ajar. I wasn't trying to hear anything. I was just walking down a hallway in my daughter's house on my birthday. He's going to sign it Tuesday, I heard Scott say. I stopped. The accountant confirmed the valuation. His voice was low but certain, the tone of someone discussing logistics. Once the share transfer goes through, we hold majority. Then it's just a matter of managing the transition. A pause. Then my daughter's voice. And this is the part I have replayed in my mind more times than I can count, she said. He won't fight it. You know how he is. He'd be relieved to hand it over. He's been looking tired. He's been looking tired. She said it the way you describe a car that's getting old. Something you're deciding what to do with. Scott laughed a little. 64 with no succession plan and a bleeding heart for every employee who's been there 20 years. Honestly, the man is lucky we're stepping in now before the thing falls apart on its own. I stood in that hallway for what felt like a long time. The voices kept going. Details about restructuring, about which senior accounts they keep, about Ray and two of the other long-timers being redundant in the new model. I heard my name once more, and the word my son-in-law used to describe me was not cruel exactly, but it was the word you use for someone you've already decided is in the past. He called me the old setup, like I was scaffolding. Useful once, now in the way. I walked back to the dining room. I sat down. I ate the rest of my birthday dinner. I didn't say anything that night. The thing people don't understand about a moment like that is that the grief hits first, before the anger. You don't sit in that chair thinking about what you're going to do. You sit there looking at your daughter pouring coffee and remembering the 11-year-old with the math homework, and you feel something collapse inside you that doesn't make a sound. I smiled when people told stories. I thanked everyone for coming. I drove home alone on the 417 with the radio off. That night I sat in my kitchen for 2 hours with the bad coffee and the river view, and I made a decision. Not an angry decision, a clear one. I was not going to sign anything on Tuesday. Monday morning I called my lawyer before I called anyone else. Marguerite had handled my affairs since my wife's estate. And she was exactly the kind of woman you want on your side. Unhurried, precise, and completely impossible to rattle. I told her what I'd heard. I told her about Tuesday's appointment with my accountant, the one where I'd been planning to formally begin the share transfer to Vivian. Don't go to that meeting, she said simply. I wasn't planning to. Good. Now tell me everything about the current corporate structure. We spent 90 minutes on the phone. By the end, I understood my own company better than I had in years, because I'd been slowly, gradually, without noticing it, stepping back, taking fewer site visits, letting Vivian handle more client relationships, trusting Scott to manage the procurement side because I genuinely thought I was preparing them, grooming her for a handover I believed we all wanted the same way. I had been preparing her to take over a company she had apparently already decided was hers. I cancelled Tuesday's meeting by text, telling my accountant I needed more time to review the documents. Vivian called me that afternoon. Her voice was careful in a way it hadn't been at dinner, a tightness underneath the normal warmth. Dad, is everything okay? Perfectly fine, I said. I just want to understand what I'm signing. A beat of silence. Of course. Take all the time you need. I had built a business by reading people and reading projects, and I knew in that 2-second pause that my daughter knew something was different. I also knew she wouldn't say so. She would wait to see what I did next. What I did next was not what either of us expected. I went back to work. Not in a symbolic way. I mean, I showed up at the yard at 7 in the morning on Wednesday, put on a side jacket, and spent the day doing what I used to do before I started treating myself like a man who was already retired. I sat in on the estimating session for a commercial project in Kannada. I called 3 clients I hadn't spoken to directly in over a year. I had lunch with 3 in the side trailer and asked him, honestly and specifically, how the company actually looked from where he was standing. Ray is 61. Been with me since the early days. He chewed his sandwich for a long time before he answered. Vivian's good, he said. She's smart, but Scott's been moving things around. Suppliers. A few accounts. Some of the changes make sense and some of them I can't figure out the reason for. He looked at me directly. I didn't want to say anything because I thought it was the plan. It was, I said. I'm reconsidering the timeline. Over the next several weeks, I quietly, carefully did what I should have been doing all along. I paid attention. I went through the contracts and the books with Marguerite and a forensic accountant she recommended. Nothing illegal had been done, but there was a pattern. A slow, careful repositioning of relationships and access that would have made it very difficult for me to reclaim operational control once the share transfer happened. Scott had been thorough. He'd been planning this for longer than a birthday dinner conversation. I didn't confront Vivian right away. I needed to know what I was confronting. 3 weeks after the birthday dinner, I asked her to meet me for breakfast at the same diner on Bank Street where her mother and I used to take her on Sunday mornings when she was small. She ordered the same thing she always ordered: eggs Benedict, coffee black. I watched her do it, and I thought about how much of who she was came from watching us. From this table, from all the ordinary Sundays when nobody thought they were teaching anything. I put down my coffee cup and I said, I heard you and Scott talking on my birthday. She went very still. The hallway, I said. I was walking to the washroom. She didn't deny it. That surprised me, and it was the first thing that gave me something to hold on to, because it meant that whatever else was happening, she was not going to look me in the eye and lie. How much did you hear? She asked. Enough. She looked out the window at Bank Street. It was November now, grey and starting to spit sleet. She turned her coffee cup in both hands the way her mother used to do when she was thinking. It wasn't what it sounded like, she started. I think it was exactly what it sounded like, I said. Not angry. Just steady. I think Scott has a plan for the company that doesn't have much room for the people who built it, and I think somewhere along the way, you stopped seeing the difference between inheriting something and taking it. She flinched. It was small, but I saw it. I worked for this company, she said. I gave up a job in Toronto to come back here. I put years into this. You did, I said. And I'm grateful for that. I watched you become genuinely good at it. But there's a difference between earning something and deciding you've already earned it before the conversations happened. What followed was not a quick conversation. We sat at that table for nearly 2 hours. She was defensive and then quiet. And then, at a certain point, she started crying. Not to wish people cry to get something, but the kind that comes up from somewhere low and catches them off guard. She told me Scott had been pushing for the transfer for over a year. That he'd framed it as protecting me, protecting the company, being responsible. That she'd convinced herself it was the right thing, and somewhere in the convincing, she'd stopped asking whether I agreed. I asked her what she wanted, not what Scott wanted. What she wanted. She took a long time answering that. I want to run the company, she said finally. I do, but I want to have actually earned it. That was the moment I made my decision. I went home and I called Marguerite and I told her what I wanted to do. She was quiet for a moment and then she said, "That's either very wise or very generous." I told her I thought it might be both. Here is what I proposed to Vivienne, and only to Vivienne, in a formal letter Marguerite drafted. A 12-month operational trial. She would take on the managing director role, with real authority and real responsibility. Client relationships, staffing, procurement, financial reporting. I would step into a board chair position, available for consultation, not involved in day-to-day decisions. At the end of 12 months, an independent review. If the company was healthy and she had demonstrated that she could lead it without dismantling what made it valuable, the relationships, the reputation, the people, the share transfer would proceed on terms we'd negotiate together. Scott was not part of the proposal. His role in the company would need to be discussed separately, with appropriate boundaries. Vivian read the letter twice at my kitchen table and then she said, "What about Scott?" "That's a question for you to answer," I said. "What he said about Ray and the others. People who showed up for this company for 20 years, that told me something. I need to know that you see what I see when I say that." She was quiet. "I see it," she said. "I've seen it for a while. The first 3 months were hard. Not because Vivian wasn't capable. She was, but because having real authority meant having real consequences. And some of those consequences were difficult in ways she hadn't anticipated. She lost a mid-sized contract in Gatineau because she made a pricing decision that was too aggressive, and she had to call the client herself and own it. She had a difficult conversation with a project manager who'd been coasting. She dealt with a supplier dispute that Scott had left unresolved and discovered that the relationship was in worse shape than anyone had told her. She called me after the Gatineau situation, not to ask for help but to debrief. We talked for an hour. At the end she said, "How did you handle losing contracts when you were starting out?" I told her the truth, badly at first. Then better. Then it stopped feeling like failure and started feeling like an information. "That's a good way to put it," she said. 6 months in, Ray pulled me aside at a company barbecue. We still do one in July, a habit from the early years, and said, without my asking, "She's doing good, your daughter." She asked me last week what I thought we were doing wrong on the residential side. Actually listened. I drove home from that barbecue and I sat with that for a while, asking Ray what was going wrong. Actually listening. Those two things, small as they sound, told me more about who my daughter was becoming than any financial report would. Scott and Vivian went through a rough stretch in the fall. I won't go into the details of their marriage because that is not my story to tell. What I will say is that Vivian came to me in September and told me she'd asked Scott to step away from any involvement with the company, effective immediately. She said it plainly, without drama, the way she tells me about difficult business decisions now. I didn't ask questions. I told her I thought that was a sound call. The 12 months ended in late October, 1 year almost to the day from that birthday dinner. The independent review came back strong. Revenue was up slightly. Retention of key accounts was solid. And two of the long-term staff, including Ray, had received formal role upgrades Vivian had implemented without any prompting from me. Marguerite sat across from both of us at her office and walked us through the transfer terms. And when it was done and I had signed what I should have signed a year ago, Vivian looked at the documents for a moment and then looked at me. "I almost blew this," she said. "I know," I said. "Not to wish me a happy holiday. It's not to ask what time dinner was. Not to wish me a happy holiday. But the maples were the same red they'd been on that birthday. And I thought about my wife and what she would have made of all of it. She had always seen Vivian more clearly than I did. More sharply, the way mothers sometimes do. She would have seen Scott for what he was earlier. She would have known the right moment to have the conversation in the diner. But she would also have said, I think, that the right things happened in the end. Not easily, not cleanly, but they happened. I still go into the office 2 mornings a week, not to oversee anything. Vivian doesn't need that, and I know better than to pretend she does. I go because I like the smell of a working yard in the morning, the sound of crews heading out, the coffee from the machine in the side trailer, that is somehow worse than the coffee I make at home, and yet tastes exactly like what I remember from the years when all of this was still just a possibility. Rudy tries next spring. We're having a dinner for him. Vivian is organizing it. I think that says everything worth saying. I keep coming back to that hallway. The way I just stood there, holding absolutely still, listening to my daughter describe me like I was something to be managed. There's a version of that night where I walk back into that dinner and I say what I heard out loud, right there at the table in front of everyone. There's another version where I sign the papers on Tuesday anyway, tell myself I misunderstood, convince myself that what I heard wasn't what it was. I've thought about both of those versions. Neither of them ends well. The first one blows up everything before there's any chance of repair. The second one hands over something real and irreplaceable to people who hadn't yet understood what they were asking for. What I did instead was slower and harder, and I think the only thing that actually worked. The thing I've learned. Not from a book, not from anyone who told me, but from 38 years of running a business and 64 years of being a person, is that the way you respond to a betrayal says more about who you are than the betrayal itself ever could. Scott had a plan. It was a reasonably clever plan. And if I had reacted from pure hurt, from wounded pride, from the anger that honestly did come up in those first hours sitting alone in my kitchen, I would have played right into it. Angry people make bad decisions. Hurt people close doors that might still open. I didn't want to close it on Vivian. I wanted to understand what had happened to her. How the sharp, curious kid who used to ask me about late payment policies had drifted into a conversation I was never meant to hear. That took honesty from me first. I had to ask myself what role I played. I had been stepping back so gradually, so comfortably, that I hadn't noticed I was also stepping out. I left a vacuum, and vacuums get filled. What changed everything in those 12 months wasn't the structure of the trial, or the legal documents Marguerite drew up, or even the independent review at the end. What changed things was Vivian calling the Gatineau client herself after she lost the contract. It was her asking Ray what was actually going wrong and then sitting with the answer. It was her making a hard call about Scott in September without being pushed to it. Those aren't things you can manufacture. They're things that only come when someone has been given real weight to carry and chooses to carry it with their whole character, not just their ambition. Intelligence alone doesn't get you there. There are plenty of smart people who make the wrong call under pressure. What it takes is something steadier, the kind of integrity that holds even when no one's watching, and the persistence to keep showing up even when the work is harder than you expected. I'm not sure I gave Vivian enough opportunity to develop those things before all of this happened. I gave her responsibility without enough friction. That's on me. What I know is that the company is in better hands now than it would have been on that Tuesday in October. And not because I stopped trusting her, but because she stopped trusting the shortcut. The years she spent earning what she thought she'd already been given changed something fundamental. I watched it happen in real time, in small moments that don't make for dramatic stories, but that mean everything when you've known someone since they were small enough to sit across from you at a diner booth and ask you why you gave late payers a second chance. I gave them a second chance because people are more than their worst moment. I still believe that.